Hello there, this is the last video about the lore books in the Wayward Realms, and I wanted to do this because so you can just watch the entire video from start to finish with all the lore books there, or you can watch it individually from before and whatnot. I have also rewrote a lot of the older videos so that they're a bit more up to what I think they are quality-wise, and so to start with, I'm going to be going through all of them, and I'm going to be examining them on this criteria, because to me, how good a lore book is how well it achieves these 3 points. 1, does it tell us something about the world, meaning it gives us information that is in the game world that we are playing, or it is a part of it. 2, what we are reading about in the lore book is representative of what will be in the game. So, meaning that the contents present in the game, in the lore book, will be in the game. And whether that be a character, faction, place, or an idea. Now, both of those first 2 points are related, and it will be sort of mix and match between point 1 and point 2, but the general gist is that point 1 is about world building, while point 2 is about the player interacting with that world building. And the third point, which is, does it have a good story? Now, this is a fairly subjective thing, but I normally determine how good a story is how well it achieves what it sets out. So what was the intent behind the story? Whether it was to entertain, to give comment on an issue, or some other thing. And I will be talking about what the intentions of that story is. So yeah, the first Wayward Realms book is A Thief's Fall. Now, A Thief's Fall was the first one, and it is one of the shortest ones, other than the last one, which I cannot pronounce. And it is a fairly good book to start off with, for a bunch of reasons. But before I do that, I want to summarize the story so that you may know what it is about. If you want to read all these stories, it'll be in the description below. So, our two main characters, and I'm going to be mispronouncing a lot of these names. Impazam, a goblin, and an unnamed orc are running away after they stole an enchanted spear from a man called the Baron. Their plan was to steal the spear and sell it so that they can travel to Coventry and join the Order of Saint Latra. Despite the name, it is a game. But their plans went awry, they got caught while running away, and they fell into a chasm. Impazam snapped his spine and cracked his head, leaving him unconscious, while the orc just bruised himself. What follows is the orc trying to keep Impazam alive and to escape the chasm before the Baron's men find him, or a pack of wolves that are chasing them. Near the end of it, it is revealed that the orc only kept Impazam alive to ensure that his body wouldn't rot and become inedible after the food was running low. At the end, they find the entrance, and Impazam wakes up and screams at him for what he has done to him. This causes the wolves to notice, and the orc, in response, throws Impazam to the wolves, distracting them and leaving him to escape. The orc then becomes a mercenary, as the enchanted spear proved quite effective in his journey through the chasm. So, after that harrowing story, point 1. The lore book doesn't give us a lot of information, as you can tell from the summary, about the world, because its primary focus is demonstrating the feel of the Wayward Realms and what it's like. The first book, they chose A Thief's Fall specifically because they knew they wanted to portray the world of the Wayward Realms accurately, and we will get that more in point 3. But that doesn't mean there isn't anything we can get. So, the most notable piece of lore we are given is the city of Coventry. Coventry is a massive port city and the capital of the nation, a nation called Splendor. In this lore book, we aren't given any names, and the name for the nation, Splendor, is found in later stories and in other sources. But what we do get about the city is that it is surrounded by flotillas and barge towns, which does tell us that this city is an extremely important trade hub for this to happen. We also get the name of the gang called Order of Saint Lotry. We also read about orcs and goblins, but the lore book doesn't give us much in the way of information about their respective cultures. If anything, it reinforces the stereotypes of those races, both of them mean and looking to join a gang, and the orc seems to only care about himself, which for the first lore book to be released is odd, As in interviews, the team wanted to show that the races don't embody a Planet of the Hats trope, but is a minor point, especially since later lore books show a different side. And this is for anything notable for the world. But there are a few more minor points to discuss. The spear that the Orca has is an enchanted weapon. Now that was to be expected from a fantasy game and the spiritual successor of Daggerfall, and what I can only assume is a name of an orc god called Nikiti. Who they are and what do they do isn't said, but it is still worth mentioning. Being the first book released, it is important to keep in mind, as I said before, that this book sets sort of a precedent for how you should view the Wayward Realms. Because it not only expeditions or mechanically might be there, but also narratively. The book represents that the world is one that is dark. The two main characters don't seem to like each other and aren't good people themselves. They want to steal the spear, not for a noble cause, but to use it to join a gang. And the fact that the orc just ate the goblin and then threw him away to a pack of wolves as a distraction is very depressing. The tone should serve as a basis of what you should expect from the Wayward Realms. Not a high fantasy game, but more similar to a dark fantasy game. Point 2. As I said in point 1, we don't get much about the world, so the actual mechanics we can talk about are less. We will most likely be able to visit Coventry, like any other city in Daggerfall. We will be able to join a wide variety of factions, like in Daggerfall. We can also expect enchanted weapons, like in Daggerfall. But all of that is already expected because it is a spiritual successor of Daggerfall. The only thing we can gather from this lore book is how we can expect quests to be like. The tone the book sets is one that is dark and should be reflected in what the game will be like. Point 3. So what is the story trying to do? Well, the story is trying to show just how cruel the world can be. It isn't a story told for specific reasons, like of the hubris of man or something like that. It is a story that is about how the world is cruel. It is a story written in the first-person perspective by the orc himself, who most likely is just telling it because, why not? It doesn't really have an identifiable purpose. It is just about being on your guard or be better than them. We didn't see any point that both of them chose to be the way that they are, so there's no fall from grace scenario, just that they are that. It shows that the world is cruel and doesn't care about you. It will do whatever it likes to you and no one will care. Impazam isn't said to be right or that his death was his own doing, just that it happened. It's just a cruel thing. Moving on to 23 Years by the Sword. Now, as before, I will be summarizing this story. Again, it will be in the description below if you want to read it. A lore book is written from the perspective of Alexandrio de Lapons, writing his memoirs about his life as a dueling master. Not only about his experiences, but using it as a way to teach others about the dueling arts. The lore book we are going to examine is the 5th entry of his memoirs. In this book, he talks about his participation in the dwarven people's customs. It starts with him discussing about how dueling a dwarf is different than dueling a man. The shorter stature means that he can't attack vital areas of a taller opponent, while their opponent has an easier time attacking them. But that doesn't mean the dwarves are easier to duel with, because since the dwarves are shorter, they can easily hack at opponent's legs, while the opponent has to deal with a smaller target. The dwarves' vitals may be easier to reach, but that means that they can cover it easier than a larger person. They also have a better center of gravity than other races because they are closer to the ground. Then it continues after his initial discussion about dwarven dueling, that he came to this place with his friend Bjorn Ulferson, member in good standing in the, and I'm going to be mispronouncing, it'll be on the screen, Vichask League, asked him to be a champion in the Dwarven Judicator duel, where the dispute settlements are handled. The duel took place in an old Dwarven outpost, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce it, it is on the screen, which is a long history and name changes to go with it. It was originally called, the name is on the screen, Gieg, meaning Treebeard, which was named as such as they built ships there for the city of Coventry and themselves. But soon there was no more trees to cut. The town converted its industry from logging to textiles, thus renaming it to the thing on the screen, meaning the town on the hill. But Alexandrio says it's more accurate to call it the town of the hill, given its history. He then he remarks that the change was quick and it didn't affect their work. He says, very industrious people, the dwarves. His duel is against Olfur Björnsson, which is unrelated to his friend. Before the duel starts, he tries to throw his opponent off balance. With Ulfur, he enacted an air of uncaring easiness while whistling a catchy tune before the duel. This worked to great effect against Ulfur, but it didn't mean his duel would go well for him. In this duel, what he said about the dwarves' dueling capabilities proved true, as it was harder for him to get a blow against him. Ulfur, having only to defend a smaller body rather than a larger one, was to his advantage. That Alexandrio couldn't defend against a charge or being charged without great effort on his part, showing that a dwarf's center of gravity made them formidable. The only way he was able to defeat him was to use the dwarf's own advantage against him. Ulfur went in for the final blow, charging at him. Alexandrio met his charge, but didn't go against it, but instead used it to vault over him to stab him in his unprotected back, winning him the duel. And he ends the story off with saying that you can fight any opponent if you know how to deal with them. Point 1. In contrast to A Thief's Fall, this lore book gives us tons of information on dwarven culture and how realistic the combat will be. In most games, the combat is true to real life but tries to be believable. The Wayward realms seem to try to take a more realistic approach, given explanations on how fighting a dwarf will be different than fighting a human. We will have to approach them differently. This can be assumed that fighting other races and combat in general will be more realistic. Now, how realistic it will be will still have to be seen. I don't imagine it'll be Kingdom Come's Deliverance type of realism, but I do think it'll put a more effort onto it. From what we can gather from the lore book, dwarves are a seafaring race rather than the traditional idea of a dwarf, but it still retains many important aspects of a dwarf, but it is simply placed in a different environment. The dwarves still value honor, craftsmanship, and they are still industrious and master builders, giving it a familiar yet unique feel. Instead of caverns burrowing under the earth, we have massive and beautifully made dwarven ships. The other parts of dwarf culture are the dwarven judicator duels, where two opposing parties choose their champions, and whoever wins the duel wins the dispute. This is in line with a lot of traditional dwarf justice, where to prove your case, you fight it out and the worthy will win. There are also leagues that some dwarves are part of. Now, what it is exactly isn't known. It could be the stand-in for clans, or it is more similar to a guild. I also wanted to quickly mention that the dwarven homeland Nilheim, we don't get much information other than that, but if we look elsewhere, such as their Twitter feed, we find that Nilheim has more traditional dwarves. Also, the spelling of dwarfin is different than the mainstream pluralization of dwarves, be it dwarves or dwarven. The difference is that they spell it with an F-I-N instead of V-E-N, which the word fin is a part of a fish, and since they're, in the sea, it kind of makes sense. Just a small thing, not really that big, just something I've noticed. And that is pretty much it for the big stuff. Other things to mention are the second mention of Coventry, with the context that it is a good relations with the dwarven people, and yeah, nothing else. While the book didn't give us so much information on other things, it makes up for that by giving so much information on the dwarves. Point 2. What the player can expect with interacting with the dwarves is that there are people of tradition, and if you conform to the tradition, you will be respected, but go outside it and you will be disliked. This extends to the race aren't their own. Players of different races will most likely have a tougher time getting the respect. Players should also expect to see dwarves all over, as they are a seafaring race. And it is safe to assume that they will be seamen all over the coast of the archipelago. It may be likely that the player can join dwarven leagues depending on if the league means guild and not clan. Also, if the player is caught doing any criminal activity, they may be able to prove they're innocent by a duel. Again, the player should expect to visit Coventry, since this book is about dueling. I can imagine that this is a skill book that will also include like one-handed weapons or something associated with fighting. And this is what it is for the most part. The lore book was heavy on details, but those details don't translate to what mechanics the player will act. It's a lot of fluff, but really good fluff. Point 3. The goal of the story is to accurately portray dueling and to show the personality of Alexandria de Laprance. For the first part, what is said in the lore book is accurate enough. A person who is similar will have an easier time holding their ground and defending themselves. Dwarves are depicted as stronger than the average human, so that means they will have an easier time at defending and attacking. Alexandria de Laprance is such a wonderful character, and his personality makes the book a really great read. Just the way he talks about himself and others, he looks like he's having a fun time, but also not so much. It's weird to describe other than just reading it. Many skill books in this game also come off very overly dull, so it's nice to see that a skill book made by Alexandria de Laprance will be a lot more flavorful and a lot more fun to read. Safe to say this is a massive jump in quality from the first book. Next we are going to be talking about A Midwife's Tale. Now this is one of the longer books in the lore books that were released, but the reason for it is because it tells a really grand story, but in terms of world building, there is a lot there, but not as much as you may think. But before we get into it, again, I want to summarize it. It's in the description below if you want to read it. So, A Midwife's Tale is written by Bernice Ampia. It's on the screen. A midwife writing down their experience with 2 unusual newborns in a 3-part series. The first part shows her performing her duties, helping a woman, Leia, give birth, but unexpectedly Leia was given birth to twins. The firstborn, Nia, a girl, seemed happy and healthy, the same with her twin brother, Lu, except for the fact that he had golden eyes. She thought that he may have been a Cambion or Fae, but discarded that thought because he didn't look bestial or Fae-like enough. Though the father thought Brynzia had cursed the boy and forced her to take him away. Brynzia tried to argue with that there is nothing wrong with him, but was unable to convince him and so left with Lu, but would try to again tomorrow. After she took Lu with her, he wouldn't stop crying and would not eat. His twin Nia would do the same, and come time tomorrow, Brynzia went back to make them see reason. But before she could they asked her to help with Nia as she refused to eat. She went inside with Lu, and after the twins saw each other, they went quiet. There was nothing wrong with them other than they missed each other. In part 2, Leia's husband came back with men from the Inquisition. He accused Brynzia of cursing the boy and bespelling the girl. She went cold as she knew what was going to happen because of the accusation. The Inquisitor asked her what her business was there. She then said that she is a priestess of Aias, who was trained in the Temple of Coventry and was taught by Sornerius. Her training made her a skilled in midwifery and medicine. Also, fun fact, Sornerius is a Greek physician. The Inquisitor ignores what she said and begins to accuse her for not reporting this development sooner. She then tries to argue, but it is taken prisoner alongside the babies to the place outside of the village and into the dungeon. After they had slept, a different man than the one who arrested them came to meet them. He then spoke to her and told her about his theory about how these defective births come about, and how they could cure them, but not for the children. That the cause of the defects is a woman's womb being poor, but twin defects have never happened before. The twins change everything, leading him to think that they should focus on the father just as much as the mother. But the twins would still have to die as they are unworthy of life, and that she will be given the same fate as well. Brynzia hears this and stabs him with her brooch. In part 3, escape by Brynzia, disguising herself as the Inquisitor and praying to the goddess Umbria, who is implied to be a sort of twin or mirror or has some relations with Aias. After they had fled, she knew what she had to do. They couldn't go home, so she traveled to the only place that she knew would take care of the children. And again, I'm going to be mispronouncing this, but it's on the screen. Mirothere, the land of the Fae. Her journey took her far, and by the end she was completely exhausted. But she reached Mirror, and the twins were taken in. She wonders to this day if they will wonder who helped save them when they were older. She ends the story by praying to Aias, asking them to take care of the children. Point 1. Similar to 20 Swords, we also get a lot of information about the world. The Fae and Cambion are creatures that appear to other races for a variety of reasons, whether they are mundane or malicious, and that the common folk fear them, believing they are a curse and will bring ill fortune. The Inquisition is a radical, fanatical organization that will stamp out anyone not conforming to their ideas or norms. This means groups like Cambions are killed or experimented on. We also get two named gods, Aeus and Umbria. Aeus embodies the day and all its associations, and Umbria embodies the night and all its associations. We also know that she has connections with dark forces, but isn't a dark force herself in later books. Coventry is mentioned for the third time. We also get the name of the Land of the Fae, again can't pronounce it, Mirrorworth, and the leader of the Fae, Queen Mayeb. We also understand the twins Faes share a bond with each other, but also we do get a lot of information. We don't get anything more than that. It's a lot of information, but not a lot of depth, because when you ask questions like, well, where do the Fae and Cambion come from? Why do they appear in other races? That isn't answered in the story, because the story isn't really about them, isn't really about any of those things that were brought up. It's the story uses those elements to help tell its story. It's not really much for answering the world, and that isn't a bad thing, but it is important when evaluating the lore book. But that doesn't mean we can't derive anything from it. Point 2. In interviews, we know that the Cambions are going to be a playable race, so how they're going to be represented in gameplay is perhaps they will have a low reputations with commoners and high reputation with Cambions. They're also magical, so maybe a bonus magic. Also, as for interacting with Cambion NPCs, the player might have a hard time interacting with them if they aren't a Cambion themselves. The Fae, however, might not be playable, but the player will still be able to interact with them. Their leader, Queen Mayeb, has a hostile attitude towards the other races for the treatment of the Fae. They most likely will be difficult to come by. Most of them will probably be in their homeland, which again I can't pronounce, Mirrorworth, and when you do meet them, they will most likely be unfriendly to acting like tricksters to the player. I imagine most of their quests will involve the player playing pranks or performing horrible deeds, as it seems that the Fae in the Wayward Realms take inspiration from older European stories and not more modern interpretations. The Inquisition will be a joinable faction, whose quests will most likely involve killing heretics to their ideas, or the player can just kill them if they want. They can do that for most factions in Daggerfall. So Aeus and Umbria are gods that the player can worship. Coventry, being mentioned yet again, seems to indicate that it's such an important city that it is on the same level of importance as Daggerfall City as it was in Daggerfall. From that, we can say that the player will interact with the city quite often. The lore book does a great job of giving us a lot of information on what the player will encounter in the game. Point 3. The story sets out to show how paranoia and superstition can cause harm to those inflicted and those on the side. Bernzia is a simple midwife who has years of experience in handling newborns and knows that twins are not monsters waiting to be slain. They are just babies that act a bit different. The difference being Lou has golden eyes and that the twins cry when they are apart. Not that weird. If anything, most people would think that it's kind of cute for the twins to have a sense of kinship. But to the rest of the society, they are monsters waiting to be slain. That attitude has led to many innocents being killed, being Cambions and Fae. And those races resent the other races for doing that. It is a horrible cycle of hate. But Brunzia doesn't continue that or give up. She then tries to give the twins a good home and a life away from others who would harm them. And in my opinion, the story does a really great job at showing that. It also does a really good job at showing the Inquisitions as a really evil organization. They make you really hate them for what they do and adds to the dark tone that the Wayward Realms has. The next one is his summoning. Now, his summoning is also a bit of a dark one and also a bit of a shorter one, and that's not necessarily bad, but it's again something to be considered. So, to summarize the story stars two elven brothers, Gulk and Sidh, who are performing a ritual to find out the location of some treasure our highwaymen hid. Sidh is wary of the ritual because of the location, and the items used to perform the ritual makes him feel uneasy. The pond they go to is described by him as a fowl with an aura of black magic so strong we instinctively held our step. Syke expressed that he is concerned with the plan, but Kalk dismisses his worry. He knows that he and Syke both want to know where the treasure is. They begin the ritual, starting with tying a sow onto an altar. Then they both consume foul liquids blessed by Umbria. The liquid is described as a burning concoction that nearly forces you to vomit. After drinking, they ate a bitter fruit. The next step would begin. Kalko would take the role of the toad, while Syke would take the role of a crow. They continued their dance until the trees bled into the skies like panniers. Then they would start their reincantations given to them by a hag. They were summoning the all-seeing, the all-wanting, the all-knowing. After their hundreds of prayers to him, Kalk brought forth a single thousand-eyed toad, a servant to him. Kalk would lick the toad first as his role, then Syke would do the same. Both transformed to their respective roles. Syke, given an ashen dagger from Kalk, leapt to the sow and hacked at her throat, calling the court of toads to present the offering to him. The last part of the ritual had him chanting, "We call on you, blind king, your eyes seated by Fortuna's parting gift. We call on you, lost king, your mind broken upon the spires of Arshod. We call on you, doomed king, your dominion devoured with your final word. We call on you to imbue your wisdoms and augurs to partake in the attainment." But he would not be summoned. Kalk realized what had to be done and tried to take the dagger from Syke, but he refused to let go. They tumbled onto the ground. Syke accidentally stabbed Kalk. He fell onto the side of the altar. Syke lamented at his actions, as he could not understand what caused him to do that. But as he wept, crows circled and toads sang. Only when the song grew louder, he noticed what was going on. Kalk's blood flowed into the pond and formed a massive circle. What came from it was a gargantuan silk pitch-black toad sitting on a white petal. The song stopped and he asked Syke what he sought. Syke replied he wants knowledge. He then said, "Does Syke think he is ready to hold such knowledge?" Syke said yes. What follows is Syke being shown that he was adopted and that his real mother gave him to her sister, as is their tradition. But before he could ponder for too long, hundreds of scenes of his childhood flashed into him. Everything that happened to him and his brother was clear. His abusive father and the death of his mother by his hands. The whole ordeal made him sick. The thousand-eyed toad then spoke to Syke, saying that was a taste. Does he want more? Syke said yes, thinking that if he knows this much now, he cannot go back into ignorance. More images flashed into his mind, and he saw both grand and mundane events. Everything the toad could offer, he gave him. Then he asked what one piece of knowledge he wished to keep. Syke, surprised by this, pleads that he wants to keep it all that he cannot part with any of it. Then he awoke back on the altar with the knowledge gone. Syke pleaded to him to give it back, and he answered. Syke would gouge his eyes out, and the knowledge would be returned to him. He has become a sage. Point 1. What we can gather from this lore book is that the world has eldritch beings that exist. In Daggerfall you can interact with the Daedra, and while they do have some minor eldritch elements, specifically Hermaeus Mor is a typical eldritch god, but for the most part they're just standard gods. They don't look they don't act, look, or operate the same way eldritch gods typically do. Instead, they are more similar to how Western gods work. They embody a specific aspect and work towards that goal. Eldritch beings operate on either a destructive goal or a goal that is unknown to everyone except them. It seems how this eldritch being works is by gathering knowledge and coercing any who seek their knowledge into serving them. For what goal, it seems unknown, as the story isn't about that being, but rather about how the beings influence those who seek it. We know little about it other than the description and possibly a backstory. The backstory being that he sought knowledge once, implying that he didn't start out like that, he is now, but became that way. So that would mean eldritch beings are made, not born. but it is likely that both are true. But that is the explicit information we can easily get from the lore book. What about the information that is not so explicit? From the lore book, we understand that there are two kinds of elves. The high elves, but I am unsure if that is their name in lore, and the dark elves. In this lore, we don't get an understanding on how the two subraces formed. The presence of the subraces in the story are used to create conflict for Sidh at the revelation that he isn't his mom's child. But outside the lore book, we know that every elf has a twin, one high elf and another dark elf. Why it is like this? That is unknown, but the fact that it informs the structure of all elf society. When a high elf gives birth, they give their dark elf child to their twin, it seems. This obviously isn't always the case, as I imagine when it comes to nobility, it probably will be a bit different. There are and can be a lot of interesting dynamics and conflicts that can come out from but in the lore it isn't too relevant, which is definitely fine, as giving too much information will bloat the story unnaturally. But that isn't everything we learned about the elves. We also can speculate that the elves are different than what the common conception of elves are. Elves normally are high and mighty beings that look down on other races for their inadequacy compared to them. This applies to most elves, with the few who don't act like that as outliers. The Wayward realms elves seem to be more just ordinary people, from the way they talk and think to even their clothes. It all seems like a thing a human would do. Now, is that bad? Depends on what you want. But Once Lost Games has stated that they want to make their race not fall into a Planet of the Hand trope. There will obviously be wildly held cultural values in any given race, but broadly it isn't a genetic thing, which is pretty cool to see. We were also given a few places names: Fort Emsk, Spires of Arshod, Fortuna, Shattered Moon of the Realm. What do those names mean? I'm not particularly sure. We can speculate that any of those names mentioned is significant, as telling the reader some unimportant place would seem counterintuitive to what a lore book is supposed to do. Fort Emsk could hold some historic value. Spires of Arshod is mentioned as a place he broke his mind, meaning that the place involves some magic. Fortuna is a moon that was broken, and that by itself is pretty significant. Sages are also mentioned, but it's not clear what they are or what they do. All we can speculate is the sage has immense knowledge and power, or they are something similar to a D&D warlock. We also get Umbria mentioned, and that she blessed the potion Calc and Sidh drank. We can speculate that since this drink was foul and he used to summon an Eldritch being, that she may be tied to the summoning of Eldritch beings. But that would be squeezing blood from a stone. It doesn't necessarily mean she is correlated with them. What also should be mentioned is the tone of the story and how it reflects the world. It continues the trend of framing the Wayward Realms as a dark and miserable place to live in. The prospective character having an abusive father is an intentional choice to show that the world has issues, as well as the entire ritual that is performed invokes feelings of dread and confusion. It all gives the player the understanding that the world is a miserable place. Point 2. The Wayward Realms is a spiritual successor to Daggerfall, and in Daggerfall you get to meet Daedra, who could give you powerful artifacts and power. The Eldritch Being may serve a similar function, but the difference may be that to contact them you may have to perform more elaborate rituals than the ones in Daggerfall, and the rewards may be more powerful, but may have a unique or higher cost. Like you may be given some powerful artifact, but as a downside like a reputation penalty or something like that. But how it will truly reflect in gameplay remains to be seen. As for the two kinds of elves, they may have some interesting reputation and racial bonuses, but to further speculate would not be helpful. We also get some location names, such as you could plausibly visit a place called Fort Emsk. Point 3. The intention of the story is to show that messing with forces you do not understand will have awful consequences. The way the story shows this is by slowly showing the effects of the ritual and the Eldritch Being on Calc and Sidh. They perform acts they would otherwise not do, and in the end, where one of them has to die, they do it. If they had just left well enough alone, they both would still be alive, and in the case of Sidh, still be himself. And another intention of the story is to show that if you learn too much about yourself that you're not ready for, that you will change. As in the case of Sidh, he changed when he found out what he really was, becoming something that prior him would be uneasy with. And the story does an excellent job at this. The Diary of Sahanna. Point 1. The story is about the perspective character Sahanna, a royal, and her experience of being kidnapped by ogres. She is confronted by her preconceptions what ogres are. Before the start of the book, she speaks about how brutish and dim-witted the ogres are, but through the course of the book, she finds out that they aren't what she expected they are. They're actually just like her, a person. It shows us that even royalty, who in most cases are more educated, fall to those preconceptions. People in the Wayward Realms view the ogres in a negative light. They aren't worth consideration. What it also tells us about is that the ogres have very little power in the archipelago. It seems from what we can infer from the books that there isn't any unified ogre nation or any clan large enough to be a political threat. What does that mean? Well, in-game we will probably see ogres, but not in any meaningful way like the human or dwarf kingdoms. We may be able to interact with them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will be involved in large quests, or their quests will be more about resolving or eliminating the ogres, depending on how they want to do it. Encountering them will also take on different forms. And as I said before, from what the books can tell us, it is going to be most likely that these are isolated areas and not really any civilization that we may come across in a city. Now, we are also given some information on their culture. They seem to be a kind people, akin to the gentle giant trope. When Sahanna asks why they kidnapped her, they said they felt sorry to do that. They could have left her on the road and just let her go, but they felt sorry for what happened to her and banished the murderer temporarily. They have concepts of justice. This gives us a lot of direct information on the ogres. There's also a lot of indirect information the book gives us as well to consider. The story continues the tone from the previous lore books. A sense of misery and tragedy fill the book. Sahanna thought the ogre brutes were brutes, but came out of it with a respect and a care for them, only for her care to be a new source of pain, as the village that kept her safe died because of it. From the story we can see here, last diary entry when her father's men has been a harrowing, woeful, misery, distress, gloom. There are no words for this. Everything feels wrong. But I must write, and I cannot allow myself to ever forget this. So, at the end, when they killed, the ogres and whatnot, she feels a sense of dread. And at the start of the book, one of her companions also died as well. But she felt very terrible about that, but she feels more terrible about the ogres, because the ogres have literally done nothing wrong to her. They banished the murderer. They aren't all conspiring against her or whatever. And that shows us that the ogres, by all means, are a peaceful, if not just a neutral race, and that should be treated like any other race in the Wayward Realms normally is. Humans would treat like dwarves and elves, well, not necessarily with utmost respect, with neutrality and not assumed hostility. That is very important to consider here. And other things that this book also gives indirect information on is some names that we get. Now, whether or not these names will be featured in the Wayward Realms is not necessarily known. I do think they will, and I'll explain now. So, the names that are given are Elmit, a city that Sahanna is going to, the ogre clan name, Broghead, and a god that the ogres seem to worship, Aius, and what I assume to be another god, Sakaran, because at the end of the Sakara's greatest weapons aren't forged from iron. Now, a priestess said this, and so it's implied that this must be a god as well. Again, it could also be like a fairly well-known figure in their religion, but I'm not necessarily sure. I don't want to speculate on that. And more general information of this world is also pretty good. From these names we can derive a lot of meaning and construction of this world is, and it's really good. And especially when we hear the ogre names, it also gives us a sort of expectation of what we should expect, how ogre names should sound like and how they should look like. Now, how well does the story do on point 2? As I've said multiple times, there is a lack of context that is missing that will determine what will be in the game and what won't be in the game. The story is a personal tale describing one person and not a story where the perspective character is writing about a topic. These personal tales are wonderful, but they do make it a lot harder to know what will be in the game. Will Sahanna be in there? Will any of the human characters in this story be in there? How involved will the names of these stories be? But that isn't necessarily an answer. So, for my guess, the game will feature the gods mentioned, because as a spiritual successor to Daggerfall, you could interact with the gods, specifically the Daedra, but you could also get the blessings of the other divines. But overall, what appears to be a more like background information can be used for more quest ideas, and we'll see what happens when we actually get to it. Now, for the last point, is this a good story? In my opinion, the story set out to establish a relationship between ogres and within the world, if not at least the archipelago. It does this by showing us that the ogres respect Sahanna and feel sorry for what one of their members did. They ensure she isn't injured or uncomfortable and try to get her home. Contrast that with how Sahanna starts out hating them, but as the ogres treat her well and as the story continues, she ends off respecting them. But tragically, it is too late for her to do anything about it, as she has to see them all die. Which also shows how dark the world is, which is also another thing that the lore books are also trying to accomplish as well. And to me, at least in my opinion, the story is really good. And I think this is just another great addition to the Wayward Realms overall. Rejected, a Wayward Realms lore book. Now, if you want to read this story by yourself, it will be in the description below. So, how does the book do on point 1? Alright, I would say. Not as well as the previous books. The story focuses on a much more narrower topic than the ones covered before. While that isn't bad, it certainly tells us less. We don't know much more about the general world or anything else, but we know a lot more on one very specific topic. And that topic is chimeras and cambions. So what do we learn about them? Not much in the story itself. If you look around on the Wayward Realms Twitter or on the community page for the Wayward Realms channel, you can learn a lot more about them. It's not substantially more, but it gives you an answer of like what their deal is. But in this one, it doesn't really tell us a lot. It doesn't tell us the whys and the hows. It focuses more on their place in the world. The main character in this story is a chimera, but as I said before, we don't know why they exist or how they came to be. Same applies to the cambions. The story is more focused on how they are treated in society, that treatment being poor. Our perspective character at the beginning of the story is supposed to be killed, but isn't due to the sympathy of one sent to kill him. The society portrayed in the book will have you believe that chimeras are inherently evil. Later on, a farmer calls the main character devil spawn. Yet since the story is told from the chimera's perspective, we know what they are thinking. We can see that their reactions and their responses aren't "I'm evil, I'm a terrible person." It's, "Oh dang dude, I'm like hungry, I'm like lost, I'm sad, I feel terrible." That's the sort of feeling that we can read in the actual book. And since the book is written from a more like a third person omniscient perspective, because we can see here, it felt large rough hands pulling it into the light. Not I felt a large rough hands pulling it into the light, pulling myself into the light. It's clearly from a third person omniscient or at least limited perspective, which is important to know because from that we get that this is an unbiased perspective of the story. Now that does give some issues on like how did we even get the story, because all these stories, these lore books are supposed to be something that you're supposed to interact with in the game, so I'm not necessarily sure how that works, but we'll get to that when we get to that. But from what we know, this story is about chimeras and how they're just like normal, ordinary things, ordinary animals. They want to be in a warm, calm, and kind place, to eat every day and be loved. Yet the society around him thinks that he is just some sort of monster to kill. Again, this gives us a lot of information to the to us and to the player that the world is hostile towards the creature, that it is by all means just a good thing, no more evil, no more gooder than anything else. And Cambions share this idea as well. They are rejected out of society or killed because they look different, even though they are just like every other person. The story goes to great lengths to have us care for them, from the Chimera feeling learned lost, and from the Cambion giving us a reason to like them. Isaac, the character in the story, who saves the Chimera by showing him kindness. And this gives us a lot to absorb, mainly that Cambions and Chimeras are just animals and people. That's simply it. And this is necessarily important to know, because in the game we won't necessarily be interacting, we won't have their thoughts, we won't read their minds unless they're mind reading in the game, but I don't think that's going to happen. What we learn is that they are simply just another creature, and this is important to know. Even if it is a very small detail, it is important to know, because on how they will interact with the rest of the world. Is it a justified hatred or is it an unjustified hatred, and how does that inform them? But what about the indirected pieces of information we get? In contrast to the prior books, we get very little. A god's name is mentioned again, Aes, and magic is used on hunting equipment. The only other thing of note is the tone. It continues the trend of the other lore books, showing that the world is a grim place, but that was a very obvious because of how the story goes. It isn't a background element as before, but it's more front and center. The only other issue I have is that these books are supposed, and as I mentioned before, supposed to be found in the world. They are written from a personal, historical, or analytical perspective, yet our main character is an animal. They can't write or speak. And since this is from a third-person, omniscient or limited perspective, how are we getting their thoughts? Is the creature's mind being read? Is that what's happening? Again, I'm not necessarily sure what the context is for how this book is even being written, but it could be just simply how it is written, so we can get the perspective from chimeras and whatnot. Again, it's not necessarily something too huge of an issue, but it is something that I need to point out to. And what about point 2? It is really well in my eyes. Both the chimeras and the cambions are going to be in the game, and the cambions are going to be a playable race. So the player through the story will get an idea on how their race is going to be treated in the world, which is very important. And additionally, the Wayward realms will have a reputation system. Now, how the reputation will be in the actual final game is up to it being seen, but this is where it gets a bit interesting. I can't necessarily find evidence of your chosen race in Daggerfall affecting your standing or reputation, but it would surprise me if the Cambions didn't have any negative standing or reputation with factions like the Inquisition. In one of the prior stories, we saw what I could assume is a Cambion, or at least a fey creature, and Cambions would certainly be categorized, at least from the Inquisition's perspective, as fey-like or something, as an evil thing, and they would have a negative disposition towards them. But again, I'm not necessarily sure if this is going to be in the game. I'm just necessarily saying it would make sense if the Cambions, as a race as a whole, would have a negative standing with factions like the Inquisition. But again, Chimeras and Cambions will be a part of the game, at least from what I understand at the current moment. Again, it could change, but from what I know and from interviews, they're going to be part of the game, which is really cool. We get a lot more understanding of the playable race that we are going to get in the Wayward Realms. Now on to the final point. The story sets out to have the reader sympathize with the main character. They accomplish this by showing the Chimera just trying to live a good life, yet they are constantly being threatened and nearly killed for simply looking like what they do. That treatment, coupled with us knowing their thoughts, makes it very easy for the player to sympathize with them. Again, it's a very small point, because you can have someone sympathize with a character very easily by just being like a normal dude being treated very awfully. But what this story does, it does it in such a well-written manner that I think it is accomplished its goal very well. Now, is it particularly original? Not necessarily, but I wouldn't necessarily say originality is that all important, as long as the story is actually well executed. And from the Cambions, we see it shows us we also should sympathize with them because they saved our main character. They did a good thing, which means that at least at the starting point we view them in a positive light, which is the goal of the story as it is, called the Fleshripper. Now, if you want to read the story yourself, just to get the context of what I'm going to be talking about, that'll be found in the description below. How does the Fleshripper do 1.1? It does fine, but also not really at the same time. And essentially, here's the thing. We get a lot of information regarding the seas of the archipelago, like encountering pirates, so we get to understand that it is a bit lawless. And we get an idea that merchants and trading vessels are a big part of this, from nation to nation trading with each other. Since this is a archipelago, a lot of ship travel will be involved. But similar to the Rejected Lore book that we talked about before, it is on a very narrow topic as it focuses on a character and a ship, Captain Lino and the Fancy Lass. And that's not necessarily bad, but it doesn't give us a lot of information on the world as a whole. It gives us a lot of information on a character and related topics on that character. Now, as I said before, it doesn't really give a lot of information because it doesn't answer questions like how does travel by sea work, how safe it is, what nations control the seas the most. It doesn't really answer those questions. But it was also something I have to note is the relationship to Daggerfall. Now, Daggerfall has a sea. It is the Iliac Bay, and it is a huge component of fast travel from going place to place. You can take the roads or the ships, which can cut down your travel time really quickly. But in Daggerfall, as I said before, it just serves those functions. But what it didn't serve is it didn't serve ship combat, which with the Fleshripper seems like it's actually focusing on ship combat as it's a very big focal point. But that's not necessarily something that I think is going to be in the Wayward Realms. But I'll get to that point when I get to point 2. So let's talk about the indirect information we get from this story. So we got newer stuff instead of like a lot of repeating names like the god Aias. We get names like Splendor, from my understanding, a port city. We get Cloutshire Silk, which is a silk. But what we also get is that Cloutshire is probably a location for a place called Cloutshire, like Chinese silk is a silk from China. And then we get Taivin, which is a location that the Captain Lino is going to, because that's where he's going to get his hole. And then we got also the name of Fleshripper, which is the name of the sword that you can see from the top here. And that's also important to know because we get some information on special items in the Wayward Realms. Now on to point 2. So, to get this out of the way, the ship in Daggerfall that you could buy couldn't do a lot of things. You could climb aboard the ship and look around, but nothing much else. But the story suggests that there are a lot more to do with ships than just player housing. Perhaps the player can engage in sea battles, either work for a faction to stop pirates and raiders, or become a pirate and take the loot aboard unlucky ships. But I'm hesitant to say that the ships will be more than they were in Daggerfall, not because I think the team won't make it, but simply because to do what is suggested in the lore book would take a lot of time that could be better spent elsewhere. When Daggerfall released, the ship was a cool house you can get in and like store some stuff if you want, but mechanically it ended there. It was very featureless, and because you had no crew, it was permanently stuck in one location and nothing much else. Expectations on what ships should look like and ship combat have also drastically risen. You can't just have what Daggerfall had, which was just a very plain wooden ship with no real details and literally no crew on it. You have to have more than that. To the point, and this expectation that has risen has caused a bit of a negative, you could view it that way, a consequence to the point where ship combat sort of takes over large chunks of the game. Newer Assassin's Creed games, for example, has the player spend a good portion of their playtime just on a ship. Now, whether that is for the main quest or side quest, but you may say that those games are fine with ship combat, so why can't the Wayward Realms do that? Well, because those games had a limit to how many ship battles you could do. There was a finite amount that you could have in Assassin's Creed. There was only so many. Daggerfall doesn't really have that, and Wayward Realms is going to be similar to that, with having Radiant quests. You can take on as many side quests as you want, and you'll never run out of side content to do. That would, in my mind, apply to the ships as well. You would have to repeat a very similar process from ship battles, with no real new mechanical additions whatsoever. You could probably have better tiers of ships, but eventually that you'll reach that tier, and when you reach that tier, there's nothing else really for you to do. And additionally, ship combat is so different from the regular flow of combat that it'll feel a lot more exhausting to do, and it'll feel a lot more, it deviates from that flow of combat a lot more. Now again, they could add it, and they could do everything that I just said about how ships could act in the Wayward Realms, but to me, I don't think that it's going to be a likelihood that it's going to happen, because it's such a lot of time and development to do it, but also it may, in reality, interrupt the flow of normal gameplay a bit too much. Now, what about the other things, such as Fleshripper? Now, in the story, it's a very powerful sword. We see that the captain who's against Captain Lino just cleaves off so many people, and when Captain Lino actually gets it, he just cleaves off a lot of other people, so we can actually see it's very powerful. And it just confirms the fact that special quest items which have special unique effects will actually happen, will be something the player can attain, and that's really cool. Now, overall, I think the lore book does, on point 2 at least, fine, depending on how you think of the ship. If you think the ship isn't going to really be a thing in the Wayward Realms, it's going to do very poorly, because all this has really done is, yeah, artifacts happen, artifacts exist, which you could already kind of think that artifacts would exist in Wayward Realms, because it was in Daggerfall, and since Wayward Realms is a spiritual successor to Daggerfall, it normally just applies from one to another. But now let's go on to the third point, which is how good is it? Now this is where you can see the book is a lot more focused on. It's a lot more focused on writing a really good story rather than telling us anything about the world, which is definitely fine. I don't necessarily mind that. So the book serves, as I said before, not really as a showcase of mechanics, but more on just telling a good story. It is a pirate adventure starring Captain Lino and the fancy crew, where all the expected hijinks of a pirate adventure takes place. Lots of jokes, witty banter, the third-person narration portrays the story less as a serious battle and more of another chapter in their lives. You just turn the page and, oh, they took a massive hole and now they're in danger and now they're going to die, but they're not going to die. It's wacky and wild, you know. Plundered a massive hole, suddenly going through all their pickings out what they want, but then gasps suddenly, privateers are now looking to plunder what they plundered, and as a respectable man, Captain Lino takes off his pants and moons them. He then taunts them for missing their cannon shots, but when he is forced to fight, he fights it head on with the adventure in his heart and no dread whatsoever. The opposing captain, and he head on fights him, but luckily for him, the blood that's smeared onto his ship allows him to slide on over, which the opposing captain did not expect, allowing him to gut him and then just kill him outright. He then takes his sword Fleshripper and he just kills the rest of the other crew. With another ship in hand, he sails off to sell it to anyone who wants to. Now, this is again very high toned, a very bright tone compared to the previous lore books, which were a lot more depressing. And again, this is a very heavy departure from that. And that's not necessarily bad, because to me it allows the writers to have more variance to how they want to write their stories. But I think it has to be pointed out that there has to be a proportion of grim and fun, because adding too much fun would kind of remove the point of the Wayward Realms is trying to do, and having too much grim kind of makes it feel less worthwhile. So there has to be a good proportional amount of these two types. And again, it gives the world a lot more depth if it has at least some fun in it. And yeah, not a lot about this book I think really adds much to the world building, because a lot of it you can kind of infer that can have it in that could be transferred from Daggerfall to the Wayward Realms. But overall, I still think it's a really good book because it focuses on writing a really good story and does it really well. I think it's a really good addition to the Wayward Realms. Piratekin of Sidh and how good it is. And now, if you want to read this story for yourself, so how does it do on point 1? The book does an incredible job showing us off a cultural cross point between the dwarves and orcs. Every 10th year, the dwarves would go to Sidh, the home of the orcs, and return the Marnth. The Marnth being a warrior who gains honor and gold by serving the dwarves. This shows us that the relationship between the two races is at least positive. To participate in this tradition shows that each party has mutual respect for one another, which is very different from other fictions where they're mortal enemies. Orcs would destroy whatever dwarves construct, while the dwarves would hate them for that. It also raises a lot of questions that makes the world feel deeper. How did this arrangement come about? Did the dwarves show the orcs they were honorable and thus became a part of the Marnth tradition? Or are the dwarves allowed to join the tradition of the Marnth because they so happen to be the only ones near the orcs of Sidh to fulfill it? Does this role exist in other orc societies? Where does the Marnth role come from anyway? What exactly is the Marnth role? While the story does show us practically what it does, it still leaves a lot of questions, and it is those questions that give us a huge impact. There are other questions such as do orcs reside in the archipelago, or are there many other orcs all over the place? Again, a lot of these questions are raised when they give us these small answers, and it's really good. So yeah, but we can learn a lot more about the Marnth on how its role is in the story. So the Marnth, for the dwarves at least, seem to be a lot more ceremonial. The Marnth interacts with other dwarves as a silent and intimidating figure. The name Marnth comes from what I have searched to be serious and intelligent. But also the Marnth seems to be used to form alliances with other pirates, greasing the wheels, one might say. To the orcs, though, it is viewed as a great mythical role that makes your name stone, implying that you will live on long after your death. This simple role in the story gives us so much rich detail and context to the world. The pirates of Crag Reef, a faction in the game, seem to be a loose connection of buccaneers united only in the fact that they are pirates. This new faction gives us the player a better idea on what piracy in the Wayward Realms is like, and that it is a very big factor in the world. An alliance of pirates that prey on anyone who comes across, or on port cities like Coventry. But what about the indirect information that we get from this book? Well, we get another mention of the city Coventry. Since its reoccurrence through nearly every story, it seems to be a city of great importance, and its reoccurrence is essentially the developers saying that you must keep your eye on this. The letter of Mark, which means a letter to go out to sea and attack ships belonging to other nations, that seems to imply that the pirates of Crag Reef are either a very organized force or a force with a lot of power. Then there's a character called a hag. Now, why I mention this very minor character is that in fantasy stories there's this trope of a hag who helps or hinders our protagonist. And when you mention a hag in any fantasy setting, they're always usually the same hag, just reoccurring in multiple stories. The obvious one is like Baba Yaga, from I think a Russian or Slavic folklore in general, and this hag seems to not be a one-to-one representation of Baba Yaga, but seems to be an echo of that. It's supposed to remind you of that type of character, and this hag helps our main character Cognac overcome his trial. We also see how powerful she is as we see her magic work when Cognac sews and cleans the bodies of the dead crew, and it's very specific in the way it says the crew is dead, is that some of their limbs have been like just cut off, and when he just sews and cleans them, it somehow brings the bodies back to life, which again really shows how powerful this hag is. Now, I'm not saying you should expect this to be in the Wayward Realms, but it wouldn't surprise me if there would be a hag-like character in the game. And that is pretty much it. There's not a lot to mention about it, and while it does give a lot more information that is very foundational, like the factions, the Court of the Dwarves, and the Orcs, it doesn't really do a lot of other stuff, because this story really wants to focus on the story aspect. So yeah. So what about point 2? Just like as I said in Fleshripper, I'm unsure if we will interact with anything sea related. As I assume to interact with pirates, we will need to have port cities and be on the sea. Now, fighting the city seems to be an expected thing. Again, you could do that in Daggerfall, and since this is a spiritual successor to Daggerfall, you can most likely fight in a city. But I'm unsure if ship combat will be a feature. But let us assume that this sea combat is a feature. The book shows us what factions we will be encountering the most, and that is the Pirates of Crag Reef. And like every other faction, we will most likely be able to increase or decrease our reputation with them. If we have a negative disposition with them, they'll most likely attack us. Then there is the Marinth. Now, I won't say we will meet a Marinth, but I think it is possible to meet a Marinth, or at least get references to the Marinth within the game. Also, to mention the tone real quickly, it seems that this book is more focused on a ballad style tone rather than a personal or historical one or a darker tone. So this seems to be shifting and telling us, the reader, that the Wayward Realms has this variety of different tones. So yeah, but now let's move on to the story. So to me, I believe the story is trying to invoke the ballads of Scandinavians. And these ballads are normally about a family or an individual life's accomplishment, or it can be about a lesson that is trying to be taught. The pirate king of Sidh is about Cognac and his journey to learn what being a Marinth means. So this is taking more of a ballad approach to teaching a lesson to other people. Not necessarily saying that the events of the story are fictional, but rather that it is portrayed in a manner that is easy to teach a lesson. The story of the Marinth is a honorable warrior who goes out and serves others. It seems to be more, not necessarily as a rite of passage, but a sort of aspirational point that you can grab. And Cognac is poor in that. He doesn't really understand the role of being a Marinth. The first part is showing Cognac's character, and the second part is addressing Cognac's character flaws. And that is what the book is about. Cognac's journey into understanding and becoming a Marinth. The book accomplishes this very well, at least in my opinion. Cognac at the start isn't actually chosen to be Marinth, but it's because he has no understanding on what it means. This role is given to another then. The reason he doesn't understand the role is because he's only focused on being a Marinth, and what it means to the context of the society. The Marinth is a patient and honorable person. He is not for himself, but for others. He is to serve others and not to be served. But he can't accept that, and that he can't be Marinth, so he kills the actual Marinth, taking his place. Throughout the first book, it shows him beginning to realize that he doesn't deserve to be Marinth, and that he has made a huge mistake. But it is too late for him to do anything, because the ship he is on is destroyed in a storm. The consequences of his actions are catching up to him. Book 2 spends a lot of time addressing his flaws and teaching him the real meaning of a Marinth. The hag character that I mentioned before is where this comes into play. When he finds his crew alive, he works to help them in any way he can, even if he is exiled by them, by essentially giving them all they need to repair the ship. And at no point does he ask to go back. He doesn't try to be obvious about it either. He tries to make sure it's not him directly helping. It's just like, oh, they so happen to find everything that they need. After he gave them everything that they needed to repair his ship, they didn't necessarily ask him to come back. But a dwarf who told everyone what he did essentially says, we need to bring him back, he deserves to come back on the ship. But they still leave without them. So this dwarf conspires against the crew to essentially make a situation where Cognac will come back and save the ship. And he anchors the ship. Cognac sees and comes to help, and he gets on the ship. He would have left, but the crew, recognizing his redemption and what he did, essentially let him stay on the ship and continue his journey to be a Marnth. He also learns the meaning of what a Marnth is. And I think this is really cool. It gives us a very good understanding on not only the concept of the world, but also it's just a really nice book as well. The Horsemen, a lore book for the Wayward Realms game. If you want to read the story by yourself, the story will be in the description. And before we get to the actual points, I want to summarize the story so we know what it is. So the story stars Elsa, princess betrothed to Darvos, Prince of Splendor, to form an alliance with her kingdom, called Agranor, so that her father can send military aid to Splendor to quell insurgents in the area. But she can't simply go to the capital city, port city of Coventry, because the insurgents have blockaded the city. Elsa is then escorted on a horseback by a horseman called Gon. They travel together until they reach the city. Elsa is afraid of Gon at the start, but over the course of the journey, respects and trusts him, due to him define her initial expectations of him. But instead of a brutish warrior, he is a thoughtful and honorable man, and Gon helps her overcome her doubt of being a good leader. By sharing his people's philosophy, which she finds very comforting. But their friendship doesn't last long, as they are ambushed multiple times throughout their journey, and the last ambush ends up killing him. She arrives safely at Coventry and vows to stop the insurgents with her people's armies. Inspired by Gon and his sacrifice, she intends to become a good leader to her people. Point 1. The lore book is the biggest in terms of word count and lore content than any of the prior books. This allows the lore book to pack in more details about the world and to better integrate it within the story. The player gets so much more information on the politics of the world, the religion, philosophy, and factions. To start with the politics, the player gets an understanding at major political players and how that might affect the game. Splendor and Coventry is mentioned throughout most of the lore books, but not a lot of information is given on them. No questions are answered on what they are, what they did, or how powerful they are, or how they came to be. This lore book answers a lot of those questions. Splendor, the nation, is set on the Isle of Coventry, and due to its geography, it is a trading nation. Most of their wealth comes from trade, and from the not-so-subtle name, it is quite wealthy because of it. The wealth seems to allow them to exert influence over the archipelago, resulting in attracting the attention of pirates. The Pirates of Crag Reef are a notable faction that raids their ships, as mentioned from the previous lore book, but also other nations looking to ally themselves with, which we see in the story. Agranor, from what we can interpret from the story, is a powerful nation both in military and wealth. They also seem to worship a different goddess than Arias or Umbria, a goddess called Diala, but that could be just Elsa and her family, or just the main patron of the nation. We don't get much else from Agranor, but we do know that they must be extremely powerful for Splendor to choose them to ally themselves, or implies something else, which is that they're a lot more in close proximity to Agranor than they are with their other allies. And with that proximity allows them to send military aid a lot more quicker, and the situation is really dire because of it. There's a lot to dig in here. With the lore book titled Horsemen, it is expected that there would be horsemen. The faction House of Khan are where the Horsemen come from. It is a Mongol-inspired faction. By that I mean it is taking inspiration from the popular conceptions of Mongols. They are horse-riding nomads who value freedom above everything. Gon, the representative of this faction, says as much to Elsa. One of his lines basically says, "A promised land full of vast plains is said that we may ride for days on end and never see a single tree." For the context, he is saying that in the real world they believe that there is a land west that is just open plains. From this line we gather that their people place this boundless freedom above everything else. The idea is present in their everyday lives to the extent that they don't name their horses, because to name a horse is to chain it forever to the world. While their people are a popular idea of what the Mongols are, they take more emphasis from the popular philosophy from their people's philosophy than their savagery, which not only makes them feel unique, but also is used very well in the story. They are other houses other than the Khans, and Gon says that most of the people live around the archipelago. And so from that we can gather that we'll encounter a lot of similar factions all across. Maybe they'll be fairly positive or fairly negative interactions, and we'll see when we get into the game. But House Khan specifically is sworn to serve Splendor, and that's why they're not really nomads going wherever they want to. But Gon isn't just the representative for his people, but he also gives information on many other places in the archipelago. The most notable being him and his people being hired by the orcs to quell an uprising in their nation. During that time, he also visited the city of Sidh, which he says rivals Coventry as the greatest city in the archipelago. This gives us so much more information about the orcs in the previous book that didn't expand upon it. We knew Sidh was something, but it wasn't really clear if it was a city, a nation, a location, or something else. They went to Sidh. And again, Kin of Sidh didn't really fail to give us anything about the city, not because it failed to give us, but because it wasn't really about it. The Kin of Sidh was about a different story, and so Sidh wasn't really necessary for that. From what we gather, that the orcs seem to be extremely capable of statecraft and nation building. If they can make a city like Sidh and have issues like uprising, that implies that they are similar to other races and not the popular conception of orcs. Religion wasn't a big point in many of the lore books, but we don't really get some confirmation. We do get more confirmation on the gods. Gon, when asked by Elsa who he worships, says he worships all the gods, but that Umbria is their main patron. This tells us that there are many gods in the setting that affect the world. He also says that there are some Eastern forgotten gods, so there are some additional gods on this. So again, a lot of information. Not a lot of crucial information like who they are, what they are, and where they come from, but still a good amount of information. All this definitely makes the world feel deeper. Now, there are still many questions about the gods, but this does give us more to go on than some names. We also get that Gon's people have Umbria as a true patron or matron, which is an interesting, as through the lore books it implies Umbria is a darker reflection or less kind version of Aes, but Gon and his people don't seem to be to embody this darker side. This new side of Umbria, or implied side, makes her and her worshippers have new depth. So as you can see, there's a lot of new lore, both new and recontextualized, but that is all the big stuff. The lore book provides but there are a few small lore bits that are worth mentioning. We see elves in the story that are part of the insurgents. Now, I'm not saying all or most elves are part of this insurgent faction, just that it is interesting that they decided to use an elf character as the only insurgent character Gon and Elsa speak to. Elves in most fantasy settings aren't part of these insurgents or similar groups. The only ones that are part of this are the outliers, but it seems that they are meant to be less like Tolkien elves and more to be similar to humans in that way. Less fair and angelic-like and more just humans, but with like different biological differences. But that is the speculation on just one character. Dwarves also make a mention here as mercenaries for the insurgents, which makes sense given the context of how dwarves operate in this world. And that is pretty much it. Nothing much else to say. Point 2. Now that we know about a lot more about Splendor and Coventry, we also understand that they are in an extremely important faction in the archipelago than what I originally thought. With this information, it is likely that the player will be visiting Splendor and Coventry often. Additionally, we know that what storylines might be in there, like taking down the insurgencies, probably meeting Elsa. You did this a lot in Daggerfall, where you could meet the actual monarchs of specific cities. In Daggerfall's main questline, you did this quite often. Joining factions like House of Khan or the insurgents, perhaps. We also know a lot about other nations, like Agronor, that the player will likely be able to visit, and the same with the orcs in the city of Sidh. The player knows much more than they did before, and what they will actually be able to interact with in the game, and what they will do in terms of quests and storylines. Gods in the setting are real, and there are many of them. Similar to Daggerfall, we may be able to join guilds that worship them, or do quests related to them. Knowing gods exist is also important to know, as it implies a lot on a grander scale. Not much else, but it does provide a good piece of context. Point 3. Horsemen sets out to tell the tale of Princess Elsa, who is marrying the Prince of Splendor, not because she wants to, but because she is forced to. The conflict here is Elsa's desire to do what she wants, but is unable to because of her class. The story explores this with her interactions with Gon, who is, in his philosophy, values freedom above all, with Elsa thinking that she hasn't been given this chance to be free, leading her to say that Gon is right. The conversation ends there, implying that Elsa should seek freedom of her own rather than be tied down to someone else's chosen path for her, or that we should view her as a tragic character forced in this position. Later she talks about how she will make a terrible queen because of her own handmaiden betrayed her early in the story when she and Gon were going towards Coventry in an unconventional manner. Her maiden essentially told the insurgents where they were. Gon then says to her that she cannot define herself based on her followers, but because what makes a good leader isn't her followers, but how they lead, how a leader leads. Then he says that he has faith in her, and that faith is an important trait to have, because if they didn't have it in their leaders, the Ugandans, I'm terribly misspelling it, they would stray from their path. She has to have faith in herself to continue, because endlessly doubting yourself will do no one good. What this does in terms of the conflict is that it tells us that while Elsa lacks freedom, that she must know that she has the power to ensure other people's freedoms. The Ugdans most likely aren't expected to do anything else but to serve as leaders. They aren't as free as Gon's people, for example, yet they, as Gon, or the people they lead, but they are freer because of it. Gon and their people are freer because of their leadership, and without them, they would be lost. This story implies that, again, Elsa, while she is tragic that she is forced down this path, should understand that she can do a lot more good as a leader than as someone who has to just do whatever she wants. She has more power in that way, and that's still valuable. The story ends with her accepting that she can't be free, but can make sure others are. And the story does an incredible job at portraying this. And this is one of the, I think, better lore books overall. I do think that the length of it does definitely help it, because increasing the length increases the ability for the writers to be able to make not only the lore and the story more well written together, but to have a story that can focus on a lot more things than just one aspect of the world or just one story of the world. The first book of the Wayward Realms wasn't bad, but it definitely didn't give us a lot of information. It was a good story about an orc and a goblin, but it wasn't really much else beyond that. But this one does not only tell a good story, but also gives a lot of information about the world overall. And I think there's a lot of value in that. Parredégais, sorry for my mispronunciation of it, and we will be talking about how good it is. If you want to read the story for yourself, the story will be in the description below. But before we get into that, I want to summarize the story so you can get an understanding of what we're going to be talking about. So, the story stars a character called Dee. The story doesn't give us his name or anything, who is writing to Vosknik, a friend, sibling, or maybe a lover. It isn't really clear who they are to Dee. The letter is informing Vosknik that he is sorry that he didn't write to him sooner, because he was shipwrecked but is now safe. He then goes on to recount what exactly happened to him, that he was saved by a man called Dolia, who took him in and helped him get to the nearest city. Dee continues to write that he helped him and his family as much as he could. One day, he sees Dolia's youngest daughter, and sorry for my mispronunciation, Aurelia, carrying driftwood and seaweed from the shore. He offered to help carry them for her, and he picked up a shell in sort of like a weird exchange kind of way. She then screamed off when she saw this shell, and Dee was shocked at this and went to go ask Dolia why she acted like this. He then proceeded to tell him that he was about to there's a tale called about a boy called Paria, who collected shells whose openings faced upwards to get the attention of Diala, the goddess of the sky. He collected so many that it made a mountain of shells. The mountain eventually caught the attention of Dahlia, as those shells belonged to Dahlia, the goddess of the sky. And he told her that he wanted to see if she was more beautiful than her mother. Dahlia was offended by the boy and then said that, but later calmed down and then said if she wanted to see if she was most beautiful than her mother, he would continue collecting shells until it reached the sky, where he can visit her. Paria then went on to collect more shells, but couldn't find any more shells that had facings open upwards. Diala then told Paria that he should collect shells that have openings facing downwards. Paria did this, but what he didn't know was that it belonged to, and again sorry for my mispronunciation, Crateus, the queen of the seafloor. She was angered that Paria is collecting her shells and giving it to Diana. She then dragged the boy into the mountain of shells, and he was never seen after that. Dee, after hearing this story, was quite troubled. He asked why he would tell his children the story, why Dahlia would tell his children the story, and he simply replied that he find it quite funny to do so. Dee says in the letter, after the story, his sense of humor didn't really return for quite a while. He ends up saying that he is safe now, and he wrote this letter in, and again, sorry for my mispronunciation, Rathuum, and it is planning to go back on another voyage for his work, and that he will see him soon, or them soon. Point 1. As for the last book released for the Wayward Realms, it is definitely an interesting one, but doesn't offer that much in the way of informing the player what the world is like. The framing of the lore book is a letter written to Vasknik, a friend of Dee, informing him what happened and what he do. The most important part of this letter is the tale of Pyria, which is a religious tale in the style of a Greek myth. A mortal seeks out the attention of a god, and either by how they get the attention or what they want their attention for, offends the god, causing them to punish the mortal in some way. The lesson learned, or the lesson that is supposed to be learned from this, is that you should be generally wary of gods. But Diolia's case is that he just wanted to scare his children for whatever reason, but just to have a fun laugh, I guess. And there's also another thing you can take this way, because a lot of religious tales also do use those tales to wear off children, like don't go near the forest at night because evil spirits might lurk, and it is sort of to disincentivize children to go out there. And so he could also, or this tale specifically, could also be meant to scare children off from the coast so they don't, feel the wrath of the Queen of the Seafloor. But in Dahlia's case, he just wanted to scare his children, no real other reason beyond that. Since the Wayward Realms is a fantasy story with canonical existing gods, we can assume that this tale is somewhat true. From accepting that, we can assume that Dahlia is a goddess of the sky and seems to be one of the more powerful gods, given the fact that she rules the sky, and in most religious places, most religions place beings of the sky as the most, or one of the most powerful beings. See Zeus, for example. Another reason why we can assume that she may be powerful, even though it may be a bit minor, is that she owns the idea of shells facing upwards, that they belong to her, and again, that could also be an indication of her power. But I don't necessarily think it's as reliable as using the context that goddess of the sky gods normally are very powerful. See Zeus again. We also get, again, sorry for my mispronunciation, Critias, Queen of the Seafloor, seen here. Curiously enough, Critias isn't named as a god, but she is implied to be an elemental or something like that based on the image of the story. And why I believe this image is referring to her is that as a child is facing the elemental, we know that the only other child in the story is Aurelia, and she doesn't meet an elemental in the story. So it is safe to assume that this creature is Critias. What does that mean? It means that there are spirits in this world that aren't related to gods, but they're their own things. In the Elder Scrolls, most supernatural elements that you see are related to the gods in some fashion, except for maybe ghosts. But the point is that it seems like in the Wayward Realms there will be other spirits that don't really relate to other gods. They can just be their own thing. The lore book does mention other things of note, like the city of Rathuum, which is all we really get. We don't really get anything else. Maybe it's a port city. Dee also went through the, sorry for the mispronunciation, Morothi channel, which at least gives us some information on geography. Dee also has some business with a group called, again, mispronunciation incoming, Dungols Ag Ithor. Again, this is all we really get. And a hint at a mini game that the player might be able to play, and it is called I-Ho, but that is just speculation. And that is pretty much it for everything in the book. No real need for a point 2 here, because the only other thing the player will interact with in this game is Rotham and Murith and the mentioned goddess. So not much there. Point 3. As the last lore book to be released, it is similar to the first lore book, as it was sparse on details and seemed to focus on more giving an accurate feeling of what the world is like. In this book, the feeling it wants to convey is cruelty and confusion. Pyra wants the goddess's attention not to challenge them or because of a fault of hubris, but because he wanted to see if she was was as beautiful as his mother, and not in a no one's beautiful than my mom. It's just like, I want to see, I'm curious. His motivations are based on curiosity and love. Yet Diala's actions show that she doesn't care why he sought her out. She's offended that he thinks she isn't the most beautiful thing ever. So she tells the boy to take the shells, unknown to him, belonging to another, and offer them to her, most likely knowing that he will die. It seems that the gods care little for mortals, or it's not a consistent thing. The feeling is expressed extremely well in this lore book, showing us that while the gods can be good, as seen throughout the lore, they can also just be as human as anyone else. For the last lore book released, it certainly isn't the greatest, but it's good enough at what it is and set out to do. And yeah, that's the last book for the Wayward Realms. And it's not as big. It's definitely not as big as the Horsemen, and it doesn't have a lot of information either. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but that does have to... it is obvious that this story isn't focused on that as much as the previous books. And again, I think it fits. I think it's a good way to end it. Not the best, but certainly a good enough way. So yeah, and if you like this, talk about it in the comments down below. And yeah, I will be doing another video on the lore books as a sort of big compilation of everything. Rewriting some stuff because I know not all of it was particularly good, and I want to at least improve it, at least as minimal, as much as I can, even if though it'll be a bit minimal about it. So yeah, I hope you enjoy, and